At any rate, yeah, so I'm Kevin Rohling, Extension Specialist in Forest Management and Ecology, and I'm going to speak with you today a little bit on emerging invasive species across Illinois. Maybe. There we go. So, what do we mean by emerging invasive species? So, we're not going to dwell too long on the question of what an invasive species is, since I assume most of you already are aware and knowledgeable about that. But in brief, it is an non-native species that causes harm to people, the economy, or the environment, in brief. In terms of the emerging aspect, could be emerging from other regions outside of Illinois, across the region, has the potential to become more widespread. And why do we care? Why does it matter? So if you're in an area where one of these species has not quite reached yet, especially if you have an outlier population, this is an opportunity for you to conduct an early detection, rapid response, and potentially keep your area free from some of these new invaders, at least for a while. So how were the species chosen for this talk? In part, I used recommendations from the Midwest Invasive Plant Network, who's been doing annual surveys with professional land managers over the last few years, at least. And so they've been surveying those folks and asking them what are the new invasives that are causing you the most headaches in general. We also gleaned information from different citizen science projects and databases. One of those is the Public Gardens as Sentinels Against Invasive Plants, which is a really neat program I encourage you to check out sometime. But these public gardens, representatives from the public gardens have been submitting potential problem species for adding to a list. And you can check that out through the Midwest Invasive Plant Network as well. And also through EDMAPS, which, if you're not familiar, EDMAPS is the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System for invasive species. And I'd encourage you to check that out as well at some point. And also through iNaturalist, which is also an app and website that records species observations of all kinds, not just invasives. And then also through personal experience and communications with other land managers. So that's kind of how we picked this handful of species that we're going to look at in some depth here today. So up first, if you're in Southern Illinois, you probably are very familiar with this species, so it might not be considered emerging for us down here, but it is in parts of Central and Northern Illinois, as you can see from these maps. So the map on the left is from iNaturalist sightings, and then on the right is through the EDMAPS uh, records. So this one's been around a while, a lot longer than some of the others we're going to talk about. First documented in Tennessee in 1919, and was believed to have been used as a packing material in shipping. So prior to bubble wrap and packing peanuts, apparently people used stiltgrass to use in packaging. So if you're not familiar, stiltgrass is an annual shade-tolerant grass. Prefers the forest understory, but can do really well on edges and also in some more open areas. Can reach a height of about 1 to 3 feet and actually up to around 6 feet once it kind of demonstrates its stilt-like growth pattern. It can kind of lean up against adjacent vegetation and get quite tall. The leaves are lance-shaped around 1 to 3 inches with that really distinct silvery mid-vein that you can see there in that photo on the left. So that's something you want to look for if you're unsure. They're really shallow rooted as an annual, and so they pull up very easily, which can be another thing that helps you to identify it. Some of the native lookalikes we'll talk about in a minute are difficult to pull up by hand. But so a little bit about its invasion ecology. A single plant can produce up to 1,000 seeds, and these seeds can be viable for several years. The seeds spread by water, but also probably more significantly now is through people moving by mowing, also with their footwear and equipment from site to site. In addition, wildlife are likely to be spreading it to some extent. In particular, wild turkeys have been found to be eating seeds of stiltgrass, which is a relatively newfound phenomenon. And I also found an online video of domestic turkeys eating kind of the entire stiltgrass plants. So some wildlife are using it. In general, fires burn with much greater intensity in areas of stiltgrass infestation. You can kind of see that intensity in this image. And so that can alter vegetation in different ways, not just through stiltgrass outcompeting adjacent vegetation, but also by changing how forest fires impact vegetation as well. And this can hinder forest regeneration in some cases. In sort of a unique study, there was a researcher who found that there were greater numbers of wolf spiders in areas that are infested by stiltgrass, and that those wolf spiders were in turn reducing toad populations and likely other prey species. So that's sort of an ecological relationship that was maybe not on our radar. Um, and it kind of illustrates how much more there might be going on than we're aware of with these invasive plants on the landscape. In terms of studies on tree seedling survival, if you think about some of these heavy infestations and how they can carpet the forest floor, there are some studies out there on looking at tree seedling survival. And some of the earlier studies kind of showed that their stiltgrass infestation were hampering tree seedling survival, but over the longer term, some later studies have come out and have demonstrated that that might not be as significant in the long term. It's just sort of another image of a heavy infestation and what that can look like. In terms of other lookalikes that are out there, one is the Learsia or whitegrass. The leaves in general are more narrow, so you can see on this picture on the left. And it also has much deeper roots and is very difficult to kind of pull out of the ground. So if you come across it, give it a tug, and you'll be able to see the difference or feel the difference in pulling that out versus pulling stiltgrass out. Some smart weeds can kind of throw you for a loop in terms of if you just kind of get a short look at one. They also have sort of that whitish or silverish mid vein, but definitely not as sort of metallic or almost shiny as it is in stiltgrass. So that's kind of the main way you can tell that when there's not a flower. Obviously, the flower would be a dead giveaway on the smartweed. So in terms of management, if you do have stiltgrass present or if you find some, especially like we talked about, like in an outlier population, you definitely want to be able to treat that as soon as possible. So in general, if you're in an area you know stiltgrass to be present, you want to clean your footwear and equipment, of course, to not bring it to other sites. Some mechanical treatments can be effective, such as mowing and string trimming near the flowering stage. Now, if you repeatedly mow, like I've actually seen stiltgrass within a mowed lawn where a homeowner was repeatedly mowing it, just like their rest of their lawn. And it was about 3 inches tall and still ended up putting on the flower head and seed and producing seed, even in a repeatedly mowed lawn. So for the mowing and string trimming to be an effective control, you want to do it later in the season, allowing that plant to mature to its full height and then trimming it down to the ground. And you can hand pull small infestations, larger infestations, that's just not going to be feasible. In terms of chemical controls, the grass-specific herbicides are very effective. Even using lesser rates than the labeled rate can be effective for stiltgrass control. You can also use the aquatic labeled glyphosate if you have populations that are near water, which is an area that stiltgrass prefers. And so you might not be able to use the grass-specific herbicides near a water body, but this aquatic labeled glyphosate might be appropriate. In general, stiltgrass increases with fire or remains stable, but one strategy might be to burn off an area with the plan to come in and conduct other controls following the fire treatment so that you would exhaust the seed bank faster. And in general, you can use an integrated method to have the best results. So we did a short trial here at the Ag Center on incorporating some native grasses into a area that we had cleared of invasive shrubs. So this picture here on the top, we had a tulip tree plantation, and the tulip trees are still present there. But underneath, we had sort of a jungle of autumn olive and bush honeysuckle that we removed with the forestry mower. And then following that woody shrub removal, there was not much of a native seed bank present for the herbaceous layer. So we decided to spray that site out with glyphosate and then overseeded with native grasses and forbs, mostly Virginia wild rye. And that has been largely successful in reducing the cover of stiltgrass and Japanese chaff flower, which are both prevalent in this site. So that might be a method if you have an area that's very disturbed and does not already have a native seed bank, to introduce native species to sort of take the place of these invaders and help resist reinvasion. In addition, because stiltgrass is an annual, you might be wondering, well, can we use pre-emergent herbicides that basically stop plants from germinating? And so we actually did a trial on pre-emergent herbicides on stiltgrass in another area here at the Ag Center. And so we tested for a few different pre-emergents and at somewhat different rates. And I'm not going to go into great detail on these, but you can see that some worked better than others. So the red is 1 month after treatment, green 2 months after treatment, and so forth. And the Esplanade Shore, which I don't recall the active ingredient name on that at the moment, at 4.5 ounces per acre, seemed to be the most effective. But we were also conducting these experiments in a site that was kind of similar to that stiltgrass experiment, where it was under a tree plantation, and so there was not much native cover in these plots. So it might be that if you tried this in an area that already has some native perennials in greater abundance, it might work better um, for helping to keep out the stiltgrass, or at least keep it at less dense um, populations. So if you're interested, though, you can still buy stiltgrass. It's on clearance, and you can pick that up online. High quality, low price. Anyway, I thought that was funny. This ad came up when I was doing some research on stiltgrass, so kind of cracked me up. Up next, we're gonna get into one that some folks are probably less familiar with, especially outside again of southernmost Illinois. So this is Japanese chaff flower or chaff flower, and so this one is a species that managers, at least down here, are extremely concerned about. And it has the capacity to rapidly expand and has been doing so. So I would not be surprised to find populations of chaff flower anywhere across Illinois, even though at the moment it is largely known from the southernmost parts. You can see there's some outlier populations on these maps. In particular, there's one up in Lake Ontario, and it's believed that um, a population of cormorants that reside on an island in Lake Ontario likely brought the seed in from elsewhere. So we'll find out a little bit more in a moment on how that might happen. So another name in some circles is oxney. So this is a plant that we have seen is occasionally mentioned for medicinal use in traditional medicine. It is a perennial herb in the amaranth family, so related to some other problematic weed species such as Palmer amaranth. This plant can grow up to 6.5 feet tall, almost can look like a shrub, except that it is an herbaceous plant that dies back each year. The, the leaves are simple and opposite, and actually can look quite a bit like a dogwood leaf. So sometimes I've had to look a little closer to get down and look at that stem and find that it is not a woody plant to confirm that it is chaff flower. Another um, characteristic for ID of chaff flower are these sort of swollen purplish nodes. You can see a little bit of that in the image on the right. So the native range of this plant is of East Asia. The first records were around 1980 in eastern Kentucky, and we did come across a video of a person who was growing chaff flower as part of an herbal garden in Appalachia and growing it for medicinal purposes. And it kind of cracked me up. We found a YouTube video, and you have a quote here from this gentleman that it gets everywhere. Quite a weed with those deep roots. It's a little bit hard to get rid of, actually, a little bit problematic. And I just thought that was a little over the top, just as I've gotten to know how difficult this plant is and its invasiveness. But so that is one possibility for how it arrived. We actually don't know for sure. Some folks believe it may have just been an accidental introduction, but it might have been for gardens in medicinal purposes. So these are just some additional images of kind of how these progress. So on the left, you see sort of the early flowering stage. And as it matures, the um, flowering stem elongates and produces these seed heads. And on the right, you can see kind of a jumble of those. And there's sort of a picture of the dormant stems of still or of the chaff flower. And wanted to get to this close up here. You can see on the image of the right, this is an extreme close up of those seed pods, and you can see these two barbs, and those two barbs cling, as you see here, to animal fur, to our clothing, and even to bird feathers. So that's kind of how we think those cormorants may have brought the chaff flower seed out to that island in Ontario. And uh, in East Asia as well, they've noted that these seed pods can cling to bird feathers, and it's been actually moving around in islands off the coast of East Asia as well into areas that are um, that it would not have been found historically. So it is a generalist that prefers moist edges, prolific seed producer again, has this extremely successful dispersal. So in addition to moving around on animals and people, it also gets around through water after floods, when the floods recede in streams and water bodies, then a lot of times that will help move the seed around as well. So some wildlife do use this species. Deer actually preferably browse it, and that's kind of what that image is there on the top. And then I've actually also noticed quite a few insects on the flowers, which I have some pictures of that here in a moment. This is just another image of sort of a dense infestation. Another way it gets around again is through mowers and people moving along trails and two-track roads. Here's those images I have of a couple of different pollinators actually using these flowers, which was kind of surprising. We weren't sure that they were pollinated in this way, so that was an interesting observation. There are a couple of lookalikes. The lopseed or Frima, uh, the native lopseed has a pretty similar look. Those seed pods are very similar, and it that structure looks quite similar. It also has opposite attached leaves, but the leaf margins are dentate on lopseed, whereas they're entire and smooth on the chaff flower. There is another Acranthes non-native invasive called devil's horsewhip. And there are some populations kind of in the southeastern portion of the US and also on Hawaii, which is where these pictures come from. But it looks quite similar to Japanese chaff flower. But it does have sort of that pinkish tinge to it. So that is one way you could tell the difference between those. In terms of management, the biggest thing you could do is just to make sure if you're in an area that has it, to make sure your clothing is clean. It loves to wedge itself into boot laces and the spaces in your shoes that you can't quite get to with your fingers. So it's a good idea to use a brush and really get those out if you're ever going to move from one area to another. And equipment. Always make sure your equipment is fully clean before going from one site to another as well. In terms of control, mechanical control by hand pulling just really isn't very feasible. It tends to break off right at the root collar, especially if the ground is dry at all. Sometimes if the ground is soft and moist, you might be able to pull those out pretty completely, but generally not recommended. chemical controls, several foliar herbicides are shown to be effective. Kind of the typical broadleaf specific herbicides, 2,4-D and triclopyr, as well as glyphosate, aminopyrrolid, and others. One issue that people have had in terms of control are that they will go out kind of during the growing season and they'll do a round of treatment, and then they'll come back a few weeks later and there's quite a few either resprouts or uh, potentially individuals that may have been missed if the spray application didn't quite get down underneath some of these larger plants. There might be smaller plants underneath, and so multiple rounds of treatment are recommended each growing season, really, to get a handle on this species. There is a study that occurred on fire and whether or not that would be useful for chaff flower management. The results were sort of mixed, but the bottom line is that it's probably not very effective at control, and so you would have to most likely use chemical means in order to control this plant effectively. So with that, we're going to dip into some other species. So up next we have wineberry, which, if you're familiar with this one, it's more of an issue, generally speaking, on the East Coast and Appalachia. If you look at these distribution maps, you can kind of see that. But there are um, increasingly known populations here in Illinois over the last few years, up around Cook County and Chicagoland, as well as St. Louis region, and then most recently down in Jackson County in southernmost Illinois. It would not surprise me as well if there's quite a bit more of this out on the landscape, um, and people just may not recognize it or may not know that it is an issue. So wineberry is in the Rubus genus. It is has multi-stemmed canes with these very dense red hairs and prickles, which can help you with the ID. The fruits resemble those in others in the Rubus genus, so raspberries and blackberries. It has these compound heart-shaped leaves, generally with 3 to 5 leaflets, serrated margins, and the underside of the leaves are bright white. So you kind of need all of those characteristics to help you with the ID of this, since rubus are kind of notoriously difficult to ID. In general, wineberry can form very dense thickets and displace native plants. Those fruits or drupes are consumed by birds and mammals and spread around. And then they can also spread vegetatively through root buds and canes that can root themselves if they're touching the ground. And so you can see here there is a butterfly utilizing wineberry, but that is also a non-native species, the cabbage white, I believe. In terms of lookalikes, other rubus species can be difficult to ID. In general, you're looking for those dense reddish prickles, though, and that's going to be a huge hint. And then combine that with the bright white leaf undersides and the 3 to 5 leaflets, and you're going to be pretty much there. The southern dewberry in the southern part of Illinois has a similar look to the prickles, but has dull green leaf undersides. I did come across this plant in a big box store a year or two ago, and I looked at it and I thought that looks suspicious. But I don't know how many folks out there are into growing rubus, but and if there's anyone out there who might be more familiar with this species, but the characteristics are very much like wineberry, and to the point that I think it may be a mistaken identity. If you look up the Rubus idaeus. Um, there's some differences of characteristics that are not showing up on this particular individual that I saw for sale. So I believe this may be still being sold mistakenly, perhaps. Um, so don't plant it. Um, but in terms of infestations, if you do end up having to control it, folks have recommended hand pulling, even with those prickles. So have some pretty good thick leather gloves. People have recommended using a spading fork on some larger individuals, and foliar herbicides are effective, including glyphosate and triclopyr. In terms of fire, it is not generally known how effective that would be on wineberry, but for other rubus species, they typically resprout and establish from seed following fire, so it is likely that wineberry does the same. Okay, we're going to shift gears here again and look at a tree species this time, the Amur cork tree. So if you think back of the distributions of some of the previous species we've talked about, and then look at this one. This one's almost like polka dotted, right? So that indicates there are several different origins of introduction, right? Versus something like stiltgrass that likely had maybe one or a handful or so of introductions and kind of spread outwards from a one or a few individual points. But when you get a species that's sort of been planted in multiple places, kind of all across a region, it has more of this polka dot look, which enables the pretty rapid expansion of invasions that start that way. This species was recommended for inclusion in this talk by multiple land managers, in addition to that Midwest Invasive Plant Network survey and the Garden Sentinels alike. So this one is increasingly on people's radar. It's a deciduous tree up to 50 feet, has pinnately compound leaves with 5 to 13 leaflets. Some people have described it as kind of a funky looking ash tree when they see it for the first time. Like, that doesn't look quite right. Um, has alternate leaf attachment, which would be a helpful hint when comparing it to ash trees, with um, those being opposite on the ash tree. It has entire leaf margins. The inner bark is this very distinctive bright yellow. So if you suspect you might have a cork tree, if you can notch a little bit out of the bark and look at the inner bark, if it has that bright yellow, you're most likely dealing with cork tree. As it matures, it develops this spongy, really thick, corky bark, but that's kind of not as useful when they are young, but as they age, that develops. It does have these round green fruits that turn black and hang on into the winter. And then the leaf scar has the bud kind of hidden under the petiole of the leaf. So that's another characteristic that you can look for. It is native to East Asia originally and has been introduced as an ornamental as far back as the mid 1800s, but not very widely until more recently, and occasionally is still planted as a street tree. It was used in a lot of arboretums and things of that nature, just as a tree of interest. But as we mentioned, increasingly viewed as a problematic invasive. A little bit about its ecology. So they're mostly dioecious, so individuals would largely be either male or female, but there have been observed on male trees that some individual limbs on the male trees are producing fruit. So not fully dioecious per se. The female trees can produce thousands of seeds per tree. And those fruits that we saw are eaten and spread by birds. It frequently invades forest openings and edges, and in southernmost Illinois, it was noticed filling in forest gaps following a severe derecho that we had a storm go through in around 2009, and a lot of those canopy gaps were found to have cork tree filling in. In terms of management, don't plant it. The seedlings can be hand pulled, but you can see how prolific those are and how difficult that might be, depending on the size of the infestation. Chemical control, you can use sort of the typical woody plant treatments that we use on many species with cut stump, basal bark applications, or foliar treatments with broadleaf specific or glyphosate herbicides. I couldn't find any research on corktree and the use of fire and how that might affect their populations, but it likely kills the seedlings and likely will top kill larger individuals that would then resprout from the base. Up next is the Amur maple. So you can kind of see this distribution pattern is kind of similar to the cork tree in a way, just kind of that polka dot, with the exception of Minnesota and Wisconsin. So it's possible that they might have a bigger problem there, or they may have just had a greater effort at monitoring for this species. This species is often lumped with Tartarian maple or as a subspecies of Tartarian maple. It is a it is a small deciduous tree, up to can grow up to around 30 feet. Like most maple or like all maples, it has simple opposite leaves. I guess not all maples have simple leaves, with the exception of box elder, and doubly toothed margins. It also has samaras like other maples as well. The native range for this species is East Asia, introduced originally in the 1860s as an ornamental benefits to wildlife and as windbreaks. And it is currently being planted as an ornamental and along roadways in particular. So this one is still out there and being sold. Prefers full sun, partial shade, displaces native plants, um, suppresses even other invasive species in some research that is out there. It is it also has likely allelopathic characteristics, so likely is emitting chemicals to suppress other plants in its vicinity. One study suggests it has passed sort of this lag phase and is entering a period of rapid expansion. So if you're not familiar with the invasion curve in invasive ecology, there is a point where the introduction has reached enough individuals on the landscape that eradication is no longer feasible. And this is likely where Amur maple is on the landscape, even though I haven't really seen it out on the landscape personally. I did, however, have an experience with this one where it was accidentally sold as a native species to me, actually, for personal use. So I ordered what I thought was supposed to be common nine bark through an online vendor, which you can see the leaves are somewhat similar, and even the flowers look superficially similar. And so I didn't really think much of it until about 5 years later when it reached reproductive maturity and there were samaras on it. And I thought, well, that's not a nine bark. And I reached out to the vendor and they suggested that I was wrong and that those were not the individuals that they sold me. They did end up giving me my money back though. So at any rate, be on the lookout for that when you're buying plants either online or in stores in general. They're not always what is labeled or stated. So in terms of control, you can hand pull and dig up small individuals. You might be able to control infestations through repeated mowing. Chemical controls would be typical foliar and cut stump treatments with glyphosate or triclopyr, and basal bark treatments with triclopyr. And according to Minnesota DNR, they believe fire might be an effective control as well, but I did not see any research or trials to that effect. Okay, we're going to change directions here a little bit and talk about an insect, the spotted lanternfly. So this was pretty widespread in the news there for a couple years. So you may have heard a little bit about the spotted lanternfly. First confirmed in Iowa in 2022, Illinois in 2023. You can see from the distribution map, it has been largely closer to the East Coast. But this is a real opportunity sort of for an EDRR, early detection rapid response. So if any folks have come across this species, be sure to report those as soon as possible, so that we can get control on those. So the spotted lanternfly is a plant hopper, part of the subgroup of true bugs. They undergo incomplete metamorphosis, so they're basically they have no pupal stage, but they have a few different instars that they go through before they become adults. The nymphs range from a 1/4 inch, kind of those black and white individuals in that top right picture, and you can see they're actually shedding that skin and emerging in that image into the next stage. The adults get to be around 1 inch long and a 1/2 inch wide or so, with black spots, and they're kind of tannish at rest. But then they have those distinct bright orange underwings with dark spots when they are open for flight. You can see that here in the image on the left. Native to Asia, first found in Pennsylvania in 2014. Likely it was hitchhiking through shipping containers. There's some more of those early nymph instars on the right, and they're coming out of that sort of dried up mud, which is the egg case. And you can see on that image on the left, on that sycamore tree, you can see kind of that dried up, looks like dried up mud patch. Those are the egg cases on the side of that sycamore. So these feed on numerous woody species, including several species of economic concern. So grapes and hops, stone fruits, and hardwood trees, which would be quite problematic for a lot of us in Illinois, especially for the orchards and vineyards here in southernmost Illinois. It does prefer another invasive species as its host plant. If anybody can guess what that is, it's in the picture. It is tree of heaven. And so some people are actually leaving some tree of heaven males on the landscape so that they serve as a place to check for spotted lanternfly, which is kind of interesting. But they can lay their egg masses on pretty much any hard surface, including firewood, vehicles, trailers, bikes, etc. So they get around, and people are likely to keep spreading them. So be on the lookout. There's kind of an image there of some laying those egg cases inside what looks like a little metal post of some sort. Another sign to look for is perhaps these fungal mats that can occur at the base of trees that are infested. And these are forming from the honeydew and sap from the damage that they're doing to the trees. And here's just a couple more kind of images to leave you with what those egg cases look like, and some of the adults and lady beetle for size. And we're nearing close to the end. So I did want to mention a few others that came up in both the surveys and some of the personal communications I had with some other land managers about their concerns. These others are ones that you should also kind of keep your eye on. Um, Tree lilac is one that I think has caught some people by surprise. Jet bead, Himalayan blackberry, another rubus, European cranberry bush, a viburnum. All of the privet species, the non-native privet species, there are several, are pretty rapidly expanding in a lot of the state. And then another new insect to the state is the elm zigzag sawfly. So what can you do? Report those invasive species. Report them to EDMAPS or iNaturalist. Land managers and people interested in working to control these species are going to be checking those sites and want to know about what they're going to have to deal with into the future. Choose native plants in your landscaping. A lot of these plants are ones that we've intentionally planted. And so if we choose native plants, that won't be an issue. Educate others. Tell everyone else that they should use native plants as well and how much of a problem these invasive species can be.